started with an email. The subject line read, "Exclusive opportunity for restoration enthusiasts." As someone who dabbled in old house restorations, I couldn't resist. The email described a stately, abandoned Victorian manor deep in the rural countryside. The new owner needed a team to assess its potential for restoration. They offered free lodging and a stipend to sweeten the deal. The attached photos were breathtaking. Ornate gables, an enormous wraparound porch, and a tower that must have offered stunning views. The house stood alone on a hill, shrouded by towering pines. Its paint faded to a ghostly gray. There was something magnetic about it, something that made my heart race with a mix of excitement and unease. I signed up without hesitation. 2 weeks later, I found myself driving down a lonely, winding road under a bruised, overcast sky. The directions were oddly specific. Turn left after the rusted mailbox with no numbers, and follow the gravel path for exactly 2.3 miles. By the time the house came into view, I felt completely isolated. The manor loomed in front of me, larger than I'd imagined. The photos hadn't captured the scale of its decay. Broken windows gaped like empty eye sockets, and the once grand porch sagged under the weight of neglect. But even in its ruin, the house was majestic, like a fading memory of something beautiful. I parked my car and hesitated. The wind had picked up, rattling the shutters. The inside was even worse. The air was thick with dust, carrying the faint, acrid scent of mildew. The floors creaked under my weight. I tried to imagine what the house had looked like in its prime. A family bustling through the wide hallways, laughter echoing up the grand staircase. But the image wouldn't stick. The others arrived shortly after me. Susan, a cheerful historian. Marcus, a no-nonsense contractor. And Ella, an architect with a skeptical streak. As the sun set, we regrouped in the parlor. The light from our lanterns made the shadows dance across the faded wallpaper, which was covered in strange, swirling patterns that seemed to shift if you stared too long. We shared our impressions of the house, but our conversation kept drifting off topic. Susan mentioned feeling disoriented in the upstairs hallway, like the space didn't quite fit. Marcus thought he heard something behind him in the cellar, but he blamed it on his own footsteps echoing. Ella laughed it off, but there was a tightness in her voice. By the time we retired to our rooms, the uneasy atmosphere had settled over us like a second layer of dust. My room was at the end of the west wing, overlooking the backyard. The bed was ancient, the mattress sagging in the middle. I lay down, listening to the wind howl outside. I woke in the middle of the night, heart pounding. The room was silent, the kind of silence that feels deliberate. Then I noticed the sound, soft, irregular tapping, like fingernails on glass. It was coming from the window. The window overlooked the overgrown backyard. There was no tree nearby, no way for anything or anyone to be tapping at the glass. The sound stopped, replaced by a low, almost imperceptible hum. It seemed to vibrate through the walls, through my chest. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't make myself move. When I finally gathered the courage to look at the window, there was nothing there. Nothing I could see, at least. In the morning, I told myself it was a dream. Sleep deprivation in a creepy old house was bound to mess with my head. But over breakfast, Susan mentioned hearing footsteps in the hallway outside her room. Ella chimed in, saying she thought she saw a light flickering in the tower late at night. Maybe it's a trick of the wiring, Marcus suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. The day passed in a blur of work. We split up to cover more ground, cataloging the house's features and flaws. But the unease from the night before lingered. Every now and then, I felt like I wasn't alone in a room. Once, while photographing the dining room, I thought I saw movement in the reflection of the cracked mirror. Just a shadow, darting across the doorway. That night, I decided to keep my lamp on. Sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing faint noises, whispers that seemed just out of reach, the groan of wood settling, the rustle of fabric. At one point, I rolled over and saw a figure standing in the corner of my room. It was barely visible, more a distortion of the air than a solid form, but it was unmistakably there. The next morning, I told the others what I'd seen. To my surprise, they didn't dismiss it. Susan confessed that she'd been having vivid nightmares. Marcus admitted he'd heard a woman's voice calling his name in the cellar, though he was certain no one was there. "We should leave," Ella said flatly. None of us argued. Packing up was easier said than done. As we prepared to leave, the house seemed to resist us. Susan's car wouldn't start, even though it had been fine the day before. My phone, fully charged that morning, was inexplicably dead. The shadows in the house seemed darker, the air heavier. We agreed to stay one more night and try again in the morning. That evening, as we sat in the parlor, the house came alive. It started with a single, loud bang from the upstairs hallway, like a door slamming shut. Then came the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, descending the stairs. We all froze, staring at the doorway. The footsteps stopped just out of sight. Then the whispers began, louder this time, overlapping voices that seemed to echo from the walls. Something flickered in the corner of my vision, and when I turned, I saw it again, the shadowy figure. But this time it wasn't alone. The others saw them too. Susan let out a strangled cry, backing into the corner of the parlor, her eyes fixed on the doorway. Marcus grabbed the nearest thing he could find, a broken candlestick from the mantelpiece. Ella just stood frozen, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The shadows were moving now. They slid across the walls like ink spilled in water, twisting and pooling in shapes that were almost human. Almost. "They're not real," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling. This is just..." A loud creak cut him off. The parlor door, which had been ajar, swung open slowly. Beyond it, the hallway stretched into darkness, though I knew we'd left lanterns burning there earlier. Something was standing in the doorway. It wasn't a shadow this time. The figure was tall and impossibly thin, its head nearly brushing the top of the frame. Its face, or what passed for a face, was obscured, but its presence radiated something primal and suffocating. "We have to go," Ella whispered. "Now." None of us argued. We bolted for the front door, tripping over furniture and each other in our panic. The shadows seemed to follow, pooling on the floor and stretching toward us like grasping hands. I felt something brush my ankle, cold and clammy, and nearly stumbled. When we reached the foyer, the air turned icy. The door was right there, but something invisible pressed against us, as though the house itself was pushing us back. Marcus shoved against it, his knuckles white, but it wouldn't budge. "What is happening?" Susan screamed, tears streaming down her face. A sound echoed through the house then, a low, guttural moan, like the house was exhaling. It vibrated through my chest, and for a moment, I thought I might faint. The figure appeared again at the top of the staircase, staring down at us. Its head tilted slowly, unnaturally, as if studying us. Ella grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "The kitchen door," she hissed. "There's another way out through the kitchen." The kitchen was worse than I remembered. The walls seemed to pulse with a dark, wet sheen, and the shadows were thicker here, almost solid. The back door loomed ahead, but as we ran toward it, the moaning sound grew louder, drowning out our footsteps. Marcus reached the door first and yanked it open. Cold air rushed in, and for a brief, glorious moment, I thought we were free. Then Susan screamed again. I turned just in time to see her pulled backward, her arms flailing as the shadows enveloped her. She disappeared into the dark as if the house had swallowed her whole. "Susan," Marcus grabbed me by the arm, yanking me back. "She's gone," he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "She's not gone," I shrieked, struggling against his grip, but the truth was already sinking in. The shadows where Susan had been were still writhing, pulsating, but there was no sign of her. Only the faint echo of her scream lingered, quickly drowned out by the low, guttural moan of the house itself. The sound vibrated through the floor, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from the very bones of the structure. "We have to get out," Ella said, her voice shaking but firm. She grabbed my other arm, forcing me to look at her. "Now," I let Marcus pull me toward the kitchen door, my legs moving on autopilot. Behind us, the shadows seemed to grow more aggressive, spilling across the walls and floor like black, liquid tendrils. The moaning sound grew louder, more dissonant, as if the house was angry. When we reached the back door, it slammed shut in our faces. Marcus cursed and threw his shoulder against it, but it wouldn't budge. Ella grabbed a cast-iron skillet from the counter and swung it at the door's window. The glass shattered, but instead of letting in the cool night air, the opening filled with darkness, an impenetrable void that seemed to swallow the light from our lanterns. "What the hell is that?" Marcus shouted, stumbling back. Ella didn't answer. She dropped the skillet and turned toward the hallway, her face pale. "There's still the front door. Her words cut off abruptly, her gaze fixed on something behind me. I turned slowly, every instinct screaming at me not to. The figure was there again. It stood at the far end of the kitchen, partially obscured by the shadows, but its presence was suffocating. The air around it seemed to ripple, like heat rising off asphalt. Its head tilted, the movement slow and deliberate, and then it stepped forward. The way it moved wasn't natural. It didn't walk so much as glide, its elongated limbs trailing slightly behind as if the rest of it hadn't quite decided to follow. "Go," Ella whispered, her voice barely audible. We didn't need to be told twice. Marcus shoved past me, wrenching open the pantry door. There was a small secondary staircase there, something we'd dismissed earlier as a servant's passage. It was narrow and steep, but it was our only option. We barreled up the stairs, the old wood groaning under our weight. Behind us, the moaning sound of the house rose to a fever pitch, accompanied now by a series of sharp, rhythmic thuds, like heavy footsteps chasing us. When we reached the second floor, we paused, gasping for breath. The hallway stretched out before us, dimly lit by a single, flickering bulb. "Where now?" Marcus asked, his voice hoarse. Ella pointed toward the far end of the hall. "There's a window in the master bedroom. If we can break it, we can climb onto the porch roof." The thudding footsteps were getting louder. Without another word, we sprinted down the hallway. The walls seemed closer now, the space warped in a way that made my head spin. The wallpaper, once a dull floral pattern, now looked alive, the flowers twisting and curling like they were reaching out to us. We burst into the master bedroom, slamming the door shut behind us. Marcus shoved a dresser in front of it, though it felt futile. The window was there, just as Ella said, but when I looked at it, my stomach dropped. The glass wasn't reflecting the room. Instead, it showed the hallway we'd just come from, only empty. For a moment, I thought it might be a trick of the light, but then I saw it. One of the shadows slithering across the reflected floor, heading straight for the bedroom door. "It's coming." Ella grabbed a chair and swung it at the glass. The pane shattered, and this time, there was no impenetrable void, just the cold night air. "Hurry!" she yelled, clearing away the shards. Marcus climbed through first, hoisting himself onto the porch roof. Ella went next, but as she swung her legs over the sill, the dresser against the door slid violently to the side. The door burst open. The figure was there, filling the doorway completely. Its presence seemed to suck the air out of the room, leaving me gasping. "Go!" Ella screamed, reaching back for me. I didn't think. I just ran. The moment I was out on the roof, I heard the sound of splintering wood behind me. I didn't look back. Marcus was already scrambling down the side of the porch, and Ella was close behind him. The drop was farther than I expected, and I landed hard, my ankle twisting painfully. Marcus hauled me to my feet as Ella reached the ground. The three of us ran without looking back, the house receding into the darkness behind us. When we finally reached the cars, I thought we were safe. Marcus's car roared to life, and Ella's engine turned over immediately. Relief surged through me as I started my own vehicle, but as I backed out onto the gravel path, my headlights illuminated the house one last time. In the broken window of the master bedroom, I saw them. Susan, standing with her arms at her sides, her face pale and blank, and behind her the figure. It raised one long, spindly hand and waved, slow and deliberate. I hit the gas, my hands shaking on the wheel. None of us spoke as we drove away, but the silence didn't feel like safety. The road seemed longer now, the trees closer, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. Ella was the first to speak. "Did we actually leave?" Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, but it carried an edge of panic. "I mean, does anyone else feel like we didn't really escape?" Marcus glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "What the hell does that mean?" he snapped. "We're in the car. We're on the road. Of course we left." Ella didn't respond right away. She was sitting with her arms crossed, staring out the window as the forest blurred past. Finally, she muttered, "Then why does it still feel like it's with us?" I shivered, hugging myself as I leaned against the door. I'd been trying to ignore it, but she was right. The feeling hadn't gone away. That oppressive weight, like we were being watched, like something unseen was pressing against my chest. "It's just adrenaline," Marcus said, his voice harsher now, more for himself than for us. "We're spooked, okay? That place was insane. It messed with our heads. But we're out now. We're fine." "Fine?" Ella turned sharply to face him, her voice rising. "Did you see Susan? Did you see her face?" "She wasn't fine, Marcus. She was..." Her voice cracked, and she pressed her hands over her mouth, choking back a sob. I shifted uncomfortably. "We don't even know what we saw," I said, though the words felt hollow. "Maybe it wasn't her. Maybe it was, I don't know, a trick. The house trying to mess with us again." "Yeah, a trick," Marcus said quickly, nodding like he was trying to convince himself. "That's all it was. It's done. We're done with it." But even as he said it, his voice wavered. Ella let out a bitter laugh. "You think it's that easy? That we can just drive away and leave it behind? You saw those things in the house, Marcus. You saw them just like I did. Do you really think something like that just stays there?" The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I clenched my fists in my lap, my stomach twisting. The shadows in the house weren't the kind that stayed in one place. They clung, seeped into your skin like smoke. "We don't talk about this again," Marcus said abruptly, his voice cold. "We don't tell anyone, we don't talk about Susan?" Ella interrupted, her voice rising. "We just forget her? Is that what you're saying?" "What do you want me to say?" he yelled, slamming his hand against the wheel. "That I'm sorry? That I don't feel sick every time I think about it? That I don't hear her screaming in my head right now? We couldn't save her, Ella. We tried and we couldn't. It's done. The car swerved slightly as he spoke, the tires crunching on the gravel. I glanced at the trees outside, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move, a flicker of shadow darting between the trunks. "Marcus," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice calm. He cursed under his breath and straightened the wheel. I could feel the tension radiating from both of them, sharp and jagged, like a wire pulled too tight. I wanted to say something, anything to break it, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stared out the window, watching the trees blur past.